Welcome everybody. I believe we've got an online audience as well as a real life audience. So welcome to the Oxford Energy Network. I think I know most of you, but my name is Tina Fawcett. I'm the convener of the Oxford Energy Network. This is Karen, who's the coordinator of the Oxford Energy Network. Before we get on to today's speaker, I am just going to highlight three things actually. The first one is next week's talk. So we're not having our own separate talk next week. It's going to be a combined talk across all the Oxford networks for the environment, which is the annual Oxford Network for the Environment lecture. As you can see here, it's how to the people, region, as this is, and this is Danny Sriskandarajan, not quite right, New Economics Foundation, who used to be the lead of Oxfam before he went to run the New Economics Foundation. So very excited about that and sort of encourage everybody to come to that. The second thing is, if you haven't already, if you use our QR code, we're asking people's opinions on these seminars and webinars and what would make it more, what you want out of them. So if you haven't already, brilliant. And the third thing we're going to mention is another talk in Oxford, which Jan is just going to say a couple of things about.
Yeah, very briefly. So on Thursday at 5:15, there's a talk at Oriel College by someone who works in Nigeria, and he has a company that deploys solar in areas that have no access to electricity. And he worked in telecoms before, but he's sort of scaling solar in Nigeria, where I think currently it's less than 1% of electricity generation is from solar, and 90 million people have no electricity. So he's going to talk about that in his talk, and there's going to be drinks afterwards, I think, as well.
Do you know whether there'll be a link, or is it impersonal?
It's going to get recorded, so there will be a YouTube, but it's not live, I think. It could be, I don't know, but I don't think it is.
Thank you.
Okay, so today's talk is by Dr. Rehab Khalid, who's come to us from Loughborough University. She's a feminist energy researcher specialising in problem-driven and human-centred approaches to sustainable energy, climate and housing infrastructure. And I think I first saw you speaking at Anglia Ruskin as part of the Global Sustainability Institute, and we met there. And she's done all sorts of interesting research. She comes and teaches on our energy systems MSc. Got a PhD in architecture from Cambridge University, where she was a sort of postdoctoral fellow there for 3 years, and is now working at Loughborough, particularly around clean cooking initiatives. Thank you so much for coming.
So my talk today is titled Remote, Rural and Peripheral: Energy Equity and Spatial Justice in Marginalized Contexts of the Global South. What does inaccess to energy look like? And how does this inaccess shape the everyday lives of people in different contexts and different spatial regions? Now, we know that energy access can vary significantly based on availability, reliability, quality, affordability, and adequacy of energy services. But we must also recognize that energy access is inherently spatial, where geographic disparities present a critical dimension of energy justice that necessitates a spatial lens. And so if we are to spatialize energy justice, we have to understand how spatial marginalization in energy access occurs. And so drawing on some of the work by Professor Buzarowski and Dr. Simcock who present a spatial lens to this, we can see that spatial marginalization can occur in a number of different ways. Through uneven infrastructure development, for example, in underserved, peripheral, remote, and informal areas. Through landscapes of material deprivation, for example, in disparities in climate change impacts or in local availability of different sources. Through geographic and regional disparities in locational, that create locational differences in affordability. Through scalar disjunctures, where, for example, national policies don't align with local needs. Through vicious cycles of vulnerability, where, for example, socio-spatial exclusion creates feedback loops. And through spaces of misrecognition, where marginalized regions are often subject to territorial stigmatization. And so to fully understand energy equity, we have to examine not just how people experience energy poverty, but also where they experience it, drawing on the intersections of the UN's SDGs 7 and 11. And so this is what I've been trying to do in my own work. And today I'm going to be presenting 3 case studies from across Pakistan, focusing on the remote, the rural, and the peripheral. Now, these 3 cases present very different energy scenarios. A case of off-grid solar electrification, decentralized community-driven micro hydropower, as well as uneven grid-connected energy infrastructures. And while these present very different energy narratives, they share similarities in how spatial inequalities influence energy access. And this is what we're going to try and draw out today. Now, before I begin, just to give you a quick overview of Pakistan's energy context. Now, like many other developing countries, Pakistan is still heavily dependent on fossil fuels and depends on a centralized energy system. It continues to face significant gaps in energy supply and demand. And despite having some very ambitious renewable energy targets, the country still faces critical policy implementation challenges and in infrastructure development, which therefore have resulted in spatial disparities with limited access in many remote and rural regions and even intermittent supply within urban centers. But let's move on to our first case study, where we focus on the remote context of a desert village, where the only plausible means of energy access is through off-grid solar electrification. Now, just to note, I've put down this paper here. So the work that I'm going to be presenting today has been published in the RSET journal as an open access paper. I've also put down the QR code here, which you can then scan, and it will take you to the paper. Right, so the case study focuses on Hilario Pir, which is a remote village in the Thar district of Sindh, right here at the foot of Pakistan. This is one of hundreds of such villages scattered across the Thar Desert that still lack grid-connected access to electricity and water. Now, just to give you a quick context to this, so the Thar Desert is the only fertile desert in the world with rain-fed agriculture as its main livelihood. With a tropical desert climate, summer temperatures reach quite high levels, up to 48 to 50 degrees Celsius. And due to increasing frequency and severity of droughts in recent years, this has resulted in reduced agricultural yield, leading to increased poverty, food insecurity, and water scarcity in the area. Now, this is one of the areas that has the lowest human development index rankings in the world. And according to the UNDP, about 87% of Thar Parker's population, or total population of 1.6 million, is below the poverty line. So our baseline survey for this village showed that households were indeed, they belonged to the lowest income quintiles with a monthly average income of $66 US. Most villagers had a primary or secondary level education, and only a small handful of men had a graduate degree. Now, most men work as laborers, often in nearby villages and cities, as farming opportunities have gradually become more limited in the desert. However, it is the women who face even greater challenges of hardship and poverty, which are then further compounded by their lack of literacy, education, access to basic healthcare facilities, and limited mobility. Now, in this village particularly, although there is a secondary school for boys, there is no high school for girls. And while boys have the opportunity to go to the neighboring villages and towns in search of to pursue a higher education, it is generally unconventional for girls to leave the village for education. At the same time, we see that many men have migrated to the nearby cities in search of better economic opportunities, but the women have been left behind with dual and triple responsibilities, such as participating in crop cultivation, livestock management, dairy production, forestry, in addition to household chores like cooking, cleaning, fetching water, child rearing, taking care of the elderly. And all of these have to be done with limited or no access to energy. Now, most households rely on firewood and manure for cooking and lighting, which form their primary energy sources. Candles and firewood are the main sources for lighting. Evening lighting is mainly used for cooking. On average, households spend anywhere between 3 to 8 hours daily collecting fuel. And women spend just over 3 hours every day cooking on these self-made mud cook stoves. Now, for anyone familiar with this area, you will know that access to clean and potable water is by far the most challenging issue faced by the villagers, and it becomes an issue for women who are responsible for collecting the water. Now, due to climate change impact, rainfall patterns have become more erratic over time, and underground water levels have been decreasing, making women's job that much more difficult. Now, in this village, we see that the only source of potable water is through water tankers that are hired, that the village pools its resources together every other month to get them to come and fill one of these underground water tanks that was put in place at some point by a local NGO. Now, interestingly, there is a reverse osmosis plant that was installed in the village some years ago, but unfortunately, it is currently unoperational and has been such for quite a few years now. And so it sits idle like hundreds of such RO plants across the Thar Desert. So just to give you a quick context to this, so the Sindh government back in 2015 launched this massive project to install over 750 RO plants in the region with the help of US aid support as part of a $33 million project. Now, even at the time, there was a lot of controversy and some questions around the feasibility and long-term sustainability of the technology and the installations. But over time, we find that just about 600 of these were actually installed. And within the first year or so, about half of them had become non-operational. Now, there are many reasons quoted in the literature and in the media for their inoperation, including malfunction, lack of maintenance, inadequate funds, lack of technical expertise, missing parts, theft, as well as countless cases of corruption and misgovernance. Now, in this village, we find that this particular RO plant became non-operational sometime. And the main reason was that the government had stopped payments for the diesel to power the generator on which this was run. But at the same time, we also find that there had been no local technical expertise for its regular operation and maintenance. So the government had hired a private company based in Karachi, which was responsible for the installations as well as the regular operation and maintenance. And at some point, they weren't paid, and so they stopped coming. At the same time, we also find that there was a lack of local availability of equipment for repair and regular maintenance. So these white pipes that you see here, so these are membrane filters that have to be ideally replaced every 2 years, but at least in this case, they were never replaced during the operational life of this plant. Now, in addition to these technological and financial challenges, we also found when talking to the residents, the villagers, that there was this perception that the quality of water that was obtained from these RO plants was not superior in any way to the water that they were drawing from the wells. And while I can't say anything about whether this was actually true or not, we do know that the membrane filters weren't replaced. But what this does show us that the knowledge building, the awareness raising, the capacity building that should have been an integral part of this project was missing. Now, the availability of water hinges on the availability of clean energy, and access to clean electricity remains a critical challenge. And we see that in the absence of grid-connected electricity, there has been an infiltration of small solar-powered devices, lights, torches, and so on, batteries from the nearby villages and cities. But then local availability and affordability still remain critical challenges. And here again, we see that women are more adversely affected by this. Because they don't have the means or access to these, they have limited commute beyond the village, and they don't have any cash or liquid assets to be able to purchase them themselves. And B, because of a lack of energy at home, it impacts them more because they're the ones who are responsible for household chores. So having no solar energy means having no evening lighting for cooking or for any other productive pursuits. And so let me just summarize some of the key reflections in terms of the spatial marginalization that we see here. So the absence of grid infrastructure in Hilario reflects historical patterns of state neglect and infrastructural disinvestment in remote desert regions that already face distributive injustices and material deprivations. An external dependence here on basic energy services creates spatialized cost burden on on a population that is already very vulnerable and marginalized, creating vicious cycles of vulnerability. And in this case, women's energy needs, specifically around cooking and water collecting, seem to have remained overlooked or at least underserved, which then creates a failure to integrate local situated practices, creating spaces of misrecognition. And so addressing energy injustices in Hilario requires not just a technological solution, but a reconfiguration of infrastructural priorities that looks at these local needs and that addresses them through co-production and place-based solutions. So now let's move on to our second case study, where we focus on the rural, exploring micro hydropower projects in KPK. So this study takes us to the very north of Pakistan, to the northwestern province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, KPK. Now, KPK is home to over 40 million people, including diverse ethnic communities and tribal populations. As a mountainous region, much of its terrain is remote, rugged, and difficult to access, with extensive foothills and valleys in the Hindu Kush and Karakoram mountain ranges. And so many parts of it remain unconnected or poorly connected to the national grid. But in this case, luckily, the high altitude rivers, streams, and glaciers offer consistent water flow and head pressure, ideal for small hydropower units and installations, which therefore offer a decentralized solution for energy access, which is what we set out to analyze. Now, again, just to note, this work has been published as an open access paper in ERS IS, and the QR code is right here. Now, when we talk about micro hydropower projects, MHPs in KPK, they're certainly not new. They have been deployed in the region since the 1980s. But there was a lot of momentum around these in 2015 when the local government embarked on this ambitious project to install over 1,000 of such installations in the area. And this was to be supported with the help of foreign aid, as well as local implementing partners such as the rural support programs, which have been working here for decades. Now, we became interested in this because our field investigations in 2021 showed that of the more than 500 MHPs that were in existence in this region, about 150 had become non-operational. And so we set out to investigate the socio-technical factors that result in the success and failure of such community energy projects. And so our field investigations included observations from 40 different MHP sites, both functioning and non-functioning, as well as case studies from 3 cases, one Chitral and 2 in Kalam, which were success stories. But our aim was really to understand what works and what doesn't within these community projects. We also did some interviews with the local government and implementing partners to get a sense of the governance mechanism. Right, so coming to the findings now. So our analysis showed that there were clear successes of the MHP projects in KPK, particularly in providing benefits to remote and underserved populations. So in terms of socio-economic development, they had been able to reduce poverty as well as enhance community well-being. In terms of educational access, there were clear examples, for example, in the Kalam case study, where there had been visible increase in girls' enrollment in schools that had been electrified. But across our case studies, we were
Just like post-pandemic, it's The projector system stopped working.
Right, okay.
So, yeah.
Seem useful.
Does seem useful, but
Brilliant. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Can we make that just the
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll continue onwards. Where was I? Yes, so across our case studies, we were able to see households reporting improved access to education and healthcare services, which had in turn improved their overall quality of life. Now, electrification had also provided critical support for local businesses and agriculture. And so with reliable power, shopkeepers, hoteliers, and artisans were able to extend working hours, improve services, and attract more customers. And this was especially apparent in the Jungle Inn case study, which had a more commercial consumer base. So they had been able to save on their energy costs while also enhancing tourism in the area. We also found evidence of enhanced agricultural practices through irrigation and processing technologies, resulting in reported higher yields and greater food security. And for households, they reported significant reductions in energy costs. Many families had been able to shift from traditional fuels, biomass, and wood to electricity for lighting and for heating. This then had also helped reduce their energy expenses as well as improving health because of improved indoor air quality reported through reduced incidences of respiratory illnesses, especially among women and children. And finally, the project had delivered clear environmental benefits, where communities reported improved vegetation, reduced deforestation, and also collectively, some estimates showed that collectively, the MHPs had been able to reduce 66,000 tons of carbon emissions annually since 2016. And this went hand in hand with reduced reliance on diesel generators and other fossil fuels, generating savings for household and local economies. Now, while these MHPs clearly had a lot of developmental gains, they were facing a lot of critical challenges as well. And the first ones being in terms of the geographical and environmental hurdles. So we find that regional climate change impacts have resulted in increased water flow variability, droughts, landslides, as well as sedimentation in the area, all of which have greatly impacted the performance of MHPs, leading to frequent breakdown and power outages. Not only this, but technical faults like turbine inefficiencies and control systems failures are reported frequently, especially for the smaller, the micro hydropower projects that are up to 150 kilowatts. And these are exacerbated by a lack of skilled local maintenance staff. Another major hurdle that we found challenge was the lack of any robust monitoring and evaluation frameworks. So there was no centralized system to track the operational status of the MHPs, their performance metrics, or even to get any sense of comprehensive customer satisfaction and user feedback. For example, in our field visits, we weren't able to find any documentation on the non-operational MHPs and their closure. And as far as we are aware, no independent third-party assessment, impact assessment, either environmental or socio-economic, has taken place in the last 15 years. But even more so than the technological challenges, we found that the institutional and governance aspects of MHPs revealed even deeper structural issues. And the first one being in terms of a lack of clear ownership structure. So while these MHPs are developed, designed, and implemented on a build, operate, transfer model, in several cases, the formal handover from the NGO or the local implementing partner to the community wasn't completed or was poorly communicated, as a result of which many residents still believed that the project was owned by and belonged to the government, as our surveys showed. And so this perception weakened the sense of community ownership and responsibility, which is, of course, essential for the long-term sustainability of such projects. Another major challenge was in terms of social resistance from some of the community members, which stemmed from a lack of engagement, personal disputes, or a perceived inequality in the distribution of benefits, for example, through elite capture. So we found that, again, in many villages, decision-making roles were dominated by a few powerful individuals, often selected through informal networks tied to family, sect, or political influence, or even in some cases to the land, where this was volunteered for the MHP installation, which then gave the owner of the land much more power. And so this led to common perceptions of nepotism and exclusion. And we found similar grievances in the conflict resolution mechanisms, which were found to be ineffective or absent. So in the Ashura case study, we found that there had been lots of disputes between the upstream and downstream residents, which had led to unresolved issues around damaged water channels, unfulfilled promises for jobs by the local government, and lack of fair compensation, which had then generated a strong sense of injustice and mistrust. And so this lack of democratic participation, transparency in decision-making, and accountability speaks to some of the broader issues with procedural injustices in the governance of MHP projects. Now, here I have to say that these challenges also exist within broader landscapes of geopolitical conflicts and instability in the region. And this has been there since the creation of Pakistan, mainly because of the long-standing Kashmir dispute between India and Pakistan. I don't know how many of you have been following the news, but even now there has been a lot of conflict, and Pakistan and India were on the brink of war last week. But it was, I think, in 2006 onwards, with the US invasion of Afghanistan, which really, again, had an impact on destabilizing the region because of the mass influx of Afghan refugees and the rise of the Taliban movement in the region. And all of these, of course, have had significant impacts on the security, stability, and peace, which then has an impact on weakening the local governance, and then in infrastructure development. So it poses hurdle to access to foreign aid, as well as the presence of the non-governmental sector in the region, which, if it has foreign ties, is often seen as an extension of unwarranted foreign control. Now, coming back to the MHPs, though, we also wanted to analyze specifically the impact of these projects on women. And again, we were able to see quite tangible benefits for women in terms of electricity access, easing household work, freeing up women's time for education, childcare, and even rest. Many women were able to many girls were able to enroll in schools that had been electrified, leading to improved female literacy rates. Women had been able to get better access to clinics and healthcare facilities. And some women had even used electrification as a stepping stone to income-generating activities. So setting up small tailoring shops, sewing businesses, and home-based enterprises, and becoming a part of the economic center of the community. Now, as good as these benefits are, they exist within persistent and significant structural inequalities. And so we see that women, despite being central to energy use at home, remain largely excluded from the planning, implementation, and governance of these community projects. So community energy committees are still very much dominated by men, with few formal roles or consultation processes for women. And so as a result of this, we see that women's needs, especially around clean cooking, often remain under researched and overlooked. So even when we see that there is household electricity for lighting and for heating, cooking is still done with polluting fuels. But of course, these gender disparities don't just exist at the project level, but even beyond that, due to the deep-rooted gender barriers that continue to restrict women's agency in the region. So in KPK, about 37% of women are literate compared to 72% of men. 40% of girls still remain out of school. And these statistics exist within broader trends of declining women's labor force participation and their underrepresentation within the political sphere, all of which is influenced under heightening religious conservatism and extremism in the area, which compounds these exclusions. And so the result is that even when women are able to benefit from access to energy through these MHPs, they still remain absent from the decision-making processes that shape these systems. So coming to the key reflections here, we see that decentralized energy projects like MHPs emerge in areas that have been deliberately excluded from centralized grid planning, which speaks to some of those scalar disjunctures in energy governance. And so here we see that spatial marginalization is not just geographic, which it is because of the physical challenges in the topography, but is also institutional when decision-making processes remain centralized or overtaken by a powerful elite, which then creates exclusionary infrastructure and spaces of misrecognition. Here we also see that technical faults or poor system maintenance or even poor system design and the lack of feasible financial models creates these material deprivations and infrastructural abandonments. And so a just energy transition in these regions must center inclusive governance, challenge local power hierarchies, and treat community participation as a right, not as a risk or a burden. And so the underlying message here is that decentralized energy without democratic governance will not lead to energy justice. Right, so now we come to our third and final case study, where we are actually moving to one of the urban centers of Pakistan, but we'll focus on the peripheries. So I'm taking you to Lahore. And before I do that, again, just to note that this work has been published in the IJR journal with the QR code here. So Lahore, the capital of Punjab, the second largest city of Pakistan with a population of 13 million, has witnessed significant urban growth marked by rising energy demand, densification, and infrastructure development. But like most megacities around the world, this development has been uneven, with wide variations and heterogeneities in its patterns, infrastructures, and transitions, where planned upper-class formal developments often coexist alongside the informal, unplanned, lower-income and slum developments that have widely differing access to utilities and services. And so in our study, we wanted to focus on 5 of such lower-income areas from across Lahore that all had grid-connected electricity and utility services and reasonably durable housing, but they represented some kind of informality and underdevelopment. Now, these 4 sites here were selected because of their close proximity to some of the core upper-class residential and commercial areas, whereas this one here was taken as a control case because it has no proximal core area, but it is still well connected through some major road networks. And so our aim for this project was really to explore some of these core periphery divides in infrastructure, understanding how they work together, how they relate to each other. And we specifically wanted to focus on women. So how do they navigate space within their neighborhoods and beyond, and how do they access energy as a result? And so our data collection included questionnaire surveys with women, as well as interviews and other ethnographic techniques. So coming to the findings now. So our analysis clearly showed peripheral heterogeneity in women's differential access to energy. And so starting with the domestic sphere, we see that ownership of domestic appliances was less in households with lower income, with tenancy residence as opposed to property ownership, for less educated women, and in the control case. We also found that across our sample, women had less access to mobile phones and internet compared to men, but that women in the control case had the least access. And this was partly because of a lack of ownership. So this was the lowest income group in the sample, but also because of women's greater illiteracy and lack of know-how in this particular neighborhood. We also found that women who were working farther away from home, especially in core areas, had better access compared to women who were working from home or from within their neighborhoods. Now, compared to the control case, we also found that women who were living close to these upper class neighborhoods had better access to employment, mobility, and to other public amenities, including religious facilities, healthcare facilities, and even to green spaces, parks, and recreational facilities. And so having better access to public space basically means having better access to the energy infrastructure in those spaces. But it wasn't just their material access that was better. We also found that women who were living in these areas that were closer to these upper class cores, they had better energy related skills, know-how, aspirations, and understandings. And this was especially true for women who were working within these core areas. So for many women who were employed as domestic house staff in some of these upper class neighborhoods, they talked about how they had learned to use different appliances like microwave ovens, electric kettles, and air conditioners, which, as quoted here, I don't have at home, but I know how to use. And so this knowledge was also translating into greater aspirations for these technologies. But even more importantly, we found that women in proximal sites also longed for more autonomy, and they put greater value to women's right to such decision-making. And so we didn't want to just focus on the different choices that women have, but also understand why they make these choices. So what are those broader values and the broader sociocultural norms within which they make these choices? And so we used the choice value norms framework, and we found that women in the control case showed consistently less control, agency, and desire for autonomy over both finances as well as electricity use decisions. So what does this tell us? This shows us that the exposure that comes with proximity to core areas impacts on women's material resources, access to material energy, as well as their skills and their know-how and their agency and perceptions of right, leading to their overall empowerment. And digging deeper into some of those intersectional differences, we also found that women's household compositions also impacted how they were able to access energy. So for many younger women who were living in joint family households, particularly those with their mother-in-laws, had less access and weren't able to make as many decisions around their energy use. And finally, we also found that religion also played a key factor in energy access for women. And so in our sample, many Christian women were found to be better able to access public spaces. They regularly visited their local churches and were more involved in community gatherings compared to Muslim women, who either because of more stringent sociocultural norms weren't able to access these public spaces, or simply because there wasn't any space allocated to them, for example, in any of the local mosques. So coming to the key reflections now. So in this case, we find that urban peripheries in Lahore, though formally integrated, experience territorial stigmatization and inadequate access to basic energy infrastructure that is then structurally reproduced through these core periphery divides. And here, peripheralization can compound vulnerabilities, where informal housing, illegal or fragile connections, and poor quality energy services restrict women's socioeconomic opportunities across intersectional lines, reinforcing those cycles of socio-spatial exclusion. We also find that if you're looking at the gender energy nexus, focusing on energy access in the domestic sphere alone can be quite prohibitive because it overlooks women's mobility, employment, and time poverty across private and public spaces, creating blind spots in service provision and a misrecognition of women's energy needs. And so for gendered spatial justice, we require a recognition of women's energy needs wherever they might be in private or public spaces, a representation of women in policy and in decision-making across the energy supply chain, and a redistribution of infrastructural investment that is aware of and conscious of the spatial disparities to ensure. I'm going to end here.